Thank you everyone for joining. We have a great number of participants joining us today and an exciting conversation ahead of us. Some housekeeping before we get started. Please do keep your videos on if possible and your microphones muted throughout the session. We'll be opening the floor later in the conversation to welcome questions, so please feel free to type them in the chat or send them directly to the host, or you can use the raise hand feature and we'll be sure to call on you. So today's conversation features a very fantastic panel moderated by Taufiq Rahim. Taufiq is Globesight's executive director, and he's led high-level strategy projects with many, if not most, of the leading global multilateral and philanthropic organizations. He's served as a fellow at the Dubai School of Government, and he's an expert advisor to the UN Alliance of Civilizations and is currently a senior fellow at New America. He's being joined by John Fairhurst, head of private sector engagement at the Global Fund, the world's largest multilateral funder of global health, investing in programs to end AIDS, TB, and malaria. The Global Fund is also helping lead the fight against COVID-19, having relocated up to 1 billion across 100 countries to strengthen local and global health systems. They are also being joined by Jennifer Lotito, President and CEO of RED. Some of you may be familiar with RED from the many brands and products that you use. The not-for-profit partners that engages the private sector in raising awareness and funds to help eliminate pandemics by harnessing the power of people and companies. So just a little bit on Globesight. So we are a global development firm with hubs in Dubai, New York, Pakistan, and Turkey, with a growing presence across the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. And what we do is we advise a range of leading organizations and multilateral institutions addressing some of the most pressing global issues, from global health, the humanitarian and development sector. We also advise them on strategy, establishing innovative partnerships to generate bold advisory and advocacy solutions. So some of our advocacy initiatives range from dialogue and webinars to knowledge and research, including reports and trackers, to full-fledged campaigns and platforms. And they are hinged largely on joint partnerships and partnered advocacy initiatives. So with that being said, I'll now pass the floor on to our moderator, Taufiq, who will initiate the conversation.
Thank you, Rula, for that introduction and for bringing kind of us together today. We have a good group of participants. We've kept this closed, so each of you have kind of been invited for different aspects of your engagement in the private sector, in the UAE, and in global health and development. We're really excited today to have this conversation with Jennifer and John, representing RED and the Global Fund as two leading organizations in the area of not just global health, but also advocacy. And at a very important time and juncture, we are making that transition in 2021, now almost 1 month into thinking about not just the pandemic and the pandemic response, but how do we really start building a healthy and secure world that can be resilient in the coming months and the coming years, not just to this pandemic, future pandemics, and future crises. I think what this year has brought to the fore is a clear understanding that we really need to be in this together across sectors, the public, private, and social sectors, and across geographies. So this is something that we really have to be interconnected, whether we're in Europe, North America, the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and anywhere else further afield. And what we want to capture today is really the specific role that the private sector can play within this response and within this architecture today and going forward. And the ideas that we generate today and discuss will also inform some of the follow-up activities and initiatives that are being brought to bear by RED, the Global Fund, and Globesight. And we'll discuss a little bit about that in some of the remarks being made by the panelists. So we just go to the next slide. I think we're going to get into some of this in the discussion. I think everybody understands where we are today. We are both confronted with challenge and hope at the same time. We obviously have the challenge that is renewed and quite severe in certain places around the COVID crisis. And the number of cases in many places, including in the UAE, has been on the rise. But we also have vaccines that are now being distributed. I think, we talk about 70 million doses now across countries. And we're reaching a point where we are going to cross a threshold of people who are vaccinated versus people who've had COVID in the world. And so that's very interesting in terms of that mark. And there are many more treatments which obviously don't get talked about as much, but actually there are treatments that are effective to a degree with regards to the crisis. Now, in the last 10 months, many institutions and initiatives have come together and new collaborations have been established to try and address the challenges now today of having these vaccines and treatment, not just reach rest of the countries which have the resources and wherewithal, but the places that really need this support the most. So we're in the midst of that kind of moment. But there is really a lot that needs to be done, and we need to challenge ourselves. So our hope at Globesight in having this conversation today, and some of the ones we're going to be having in the subsequent months, is challenging what we see as the status quo and the normal of things are just going to unfold. It really takes people to take the initiative, to take action, to not just ensure that things unfold in the right way, but to adapt the response and actually to bring the right skills and capabilities. It shouldn't be assumed that everything is going to unfold. There are places that can't be reached, supply chains that need support, and awareness that needs to be raised. So with that, I'd love to bring on John. Rula gave John an esteemed introduction. But really, John, I really want to ask you to help set the stage. Where are we really entering now and getting into 2021, not just in the pandemic, but in the response? And really, how do we start to think about what a healthy and secure world looks like, and what do we need to do to make that happen? So I'll turn it over to you. I think there's a short clip, and then you can give your remarks.
So Taufiq, everybody, thanks for that introduction, and really pleased to speak to you all, and thank you for the time today. I mean, I think Taufiq, you framed a lot of the context, and I want to talk a bit more about that. But I mean, first, maybe just to introduce the Global Fund for those who don't know it. The Global Fund was actually founded, really in response to the last pandemic, which really threatened both sort of low income and high income countries, which was HIV. And so the last 20 years, we've been working, really, I think, as the world's leading sort of disease reduction elimination agency in lower middle income countries. And so I think, have a lot of experience of how the world deals with and responds to pandemics and what needs to happen. It's been a huge success. We've saved something like 38 million lives in the last 20 years, but there's still much more to do on those diseases. And 2.5 million people die a year of HIV, TB, and malaria. And COVID, of course, has caused untold damage to those things. So maybe, Rula, to just play the video to give people a sense of what we actually do, that would be great. Thank you.
Rula, we can't hear the video.
I hope that gives you a sense of the breadth. We work in over 130 countries through sort of 3,000 local partners to really drive a lot of the changes on the sort of existing diseases that are killing people, and more recently, obviously, COVID. Maybe to expand on and Taufiq's sort of hope and dismay introduction, you know, I think it's true to say it's a mixed picture at the moment, and I think the question for 2021 is what kind of 2021 do we want to have? You know, what do we need to do in order to really drive the trajectory of this disease differently to the way it moved in 2020? At the moment, we have, you know, the highest death rates we've had in the disease. We have the highest infection rates. We have waves breaking out. Africa currently has the highest growth in mortality in the world, growing at 34%. We have this incredible toolkit that Taufiq referenced through the global collaboration. Vaccines, you know, fantastic tools, great testing, diagnosis kits, new therapeutics, and investments in information systems too. But it's not reaching the poorest countries. You may have seen the analysis that 25 vaccinations have been done in Africa, you know, which, as Dr. Tedros, head of WHO, said, is a moral failure if we think about the impact of COVID. We've seen a massive impact on health workers. Something like 2 million health workers have been infected across the world. Many of them have died. We actually don't know how many have died because most countries don't say how many health workers have died consistently. The impact of that on poor countries with weak health systems, of course, is immense. And I think one of the most frightening aspects, which isn't even in the public discourse, is the collateral damage. You know, we've seen a 50 to 75% impact on our disease programs. A 30% drop in people being tested for TB, which kills 1.5 million people a year when the testing is working well. 25% reduction in malaria treatment, which is likely to double the mortality, which is 1 million children dying a year if that trend continues. And then, of course, there's the poverty impact. You know, the first time in 20 years, poverty will increase. Education, I mean, so much collateral damage. What we've seen is a huge response by countries, you know, $12 trillion of investment in managing the domestic crisis. But we've seen zero investment in development assistance, in overseas assistance to deal with the crisis. So I think, you know, the context for me is that 2020 was a year when decisions were largely made for us. You know, we were all locked down in pretty much every country. We were told what we could do and where we could go. You know, with a lot of reason for that. I think 2021 is going to be a year where we need to make choices, and choices about how we change the direction of this pandemic and crisis. It's going to be pivotal in what we do in terms of solving it now. And it's going to be pivotal in terms of reducing the collateral damage, and it's going to be pivotal in terms of creating the systems that mean when this happens again, we don't have such an incredible impact on the world. So what are we doing? You know, as a leading sort of disease response agency, we're making sure that tools get delivered. We're making sure that diagnosis is available in countries, that therapeutics are available in countries, that the protective equipment for health workers is available to stop them being impacted and stop the collateral damage of not having health workers. And we're supporting the health systems in terms of more data, bigger capacity to deal with the strains that COVID is putting on it as well. The vaccines are crucial and they're really powerful, but if they're not embedded within a testing and therapeutic, and of course, if you don't have health workers to deliver vaccines, they really won't be effective in controlling the disease in a country, and we won't be effective globally. And of course, what we're working on is mitigating the impact on the diseases that, as I said, you know, kill millions of people a year. Now, last year we spent $1 billion doing this, investing in helping to mitigate and support the impact of COVID But actually, we exhausted our funds. We have at the moment we have no funds available to directly invest in the COVID response. We already have $300 million of urgent requests from countries around the world for more support. And it's really frightening and obviously intensely uncomfortable to be in a position of need, seeing damage, and not being able to respond, even though the tools are available, and more tools are coming online. So I think 2021 is going to be around mobilizing resources like we've never seen before in order to deal with this. And I think you must have seen, and maybe people have seen the reports around if we don't deal with the global crisis, the economic damage to high-income countries is going to be immense. Something like $2 to $5 trillion could be the impact of not dealing with this as a global crisis. So what does that mean? It means we need to be much more ambitious. I think, frankly, we need to be more aggressive about responding to this. We need the voice of the private sector to bring this to the attention of governments, to mobilize the funds to deal with it. We need the private sector to act to support the response, and that's both in terms of funding, but also in terms of, as the video talked about, the capabilities of the private sector to allow us to increase the efficiency of our programs. Every dollar the Global Fund gets lands in countries. We have no overhead in our process, so every contribution is powerful in terms of impacting on the ground. And I think it's fair to say that what we have learned is you can deal with a disease, you can drive disease down. You can only do it if you act quickly and aggressively. You do it more effectively if you act quickly and aggressively. And if we don't have the resources to do it, clearly that's a huge constraint. So I think, as we go back to business as normal, I think the key question we need to ask ourselves is, do we go back to business as normal? Because, I think it was Einstein is credited with saying if we think we're going to get a different result next time by acting in exactly the same way as we did before, then clearly that's a challenge. So I really look forward to the conversation around how we can collectively mobilize to deal with this crisis. So Taufiq, I hope that helps set the scene.
It does. And I mean, just before turning to Jen, I think, John, a question I would have is, okay, so obviously there's the Global Fund, but there's also the World Health Organization, there's Gavi, there's COVAX. So first, I mean, just is everybody working together? Is everybody just out for their own? How's this working? Because that's, a first, question I think comes to a lot of people's mind.
Yeah, well, you referenced at the beginning that, the beginning of the crisis, that the sort of global health community, if you like, came together and formed the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. And I think it's been a sort of an unprecedented sort of coordination of the global health system. And it's really brought this focus across the pillars of, we need vaccine development, we need therapeutics development, we need diagnosis and tests, and we need to build the health systems. And the collective of the Global Fund, Gavi, WHO, organizations like FIND, which is expert in developing diagnostics, and many others, the World Bank, obviously the Gates Foundation, have really driven, I think, a lot of the engagement. And it's been incredibly successful in developing the tools. Where I think it's been less successful is in mobilizing the resources. And of course, that's the conundrum we find ourselves in at the moment. We have these fantastic tools that people, the wealthier countries are accessing well in many cases. But of course, the poorer countries don't have that ability to. And I think, for all of us, I mean, the money that we're mobilizing is very much around supporting that collective effort and the different pillars. As I talked about, the diagnostics and the testing and the health workers support the vaccine deployment in the same way. So that collective is looking for nearly $30 billion over the next year to drive this impact. And I mean, the amazing thing is the return on investment for every dollar is phenomenal. If we can bring forward the end of the crisis by a day through spending that money, we will save trillions of dollars in terms of the economy and the business impact, as well as all the collateral damage on the other, diseases and issues.
I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Because if you mentioned, such a figure, which means obviously governments play a significant role, but for a lot of the private sector right now, they're suffering, right? I mean, the private sector, the business community is there, right? And so one is, what are other ways to engage, and whether it's through the Global Fund or other places, for the private sector to be able to play a role, right? Because sometimes it's not going to be with, let's say, your organization is going to be somewhere else. How do you still contribute to this kind of pandemic response, and also making a more secure world? That's one. And then the second is, related to that, we look at with the Pfizer vaccine in particular, with the cold chain storage, which is beyond what even you'd normally have for some of the vaccinations. And you think about probably people who had a really good vaccine cold chain storage approach prior are going to be ahead of the curve, and especially when it comes to the logistics of transporting that internationally, where, like, you've seen that in the UAE play a role in logistics. So I mean, are there other ways also the private sector can help prepare that resilience
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I think the private sector has, I mean, already is playing, an incredible role. I think, one of the critical roles is the voice, and the voice to make sure the balance of the agenda is right. And whether it's a moral, perspective or an economic perspective, they're actually fundamentally aligned here, to say that we need to make this investment, and these are investments that are valuable for governments to make, and also philanthropists and businesses too. I think the second one is obviously money, but recognizing, like governments, there's a strain on everybody. Although there are also businesses that have done very well in the current crisis too. But recognizing that is important too. And one of the critical things that we find around private money, and I think it's true for the other partners like Gavi and others, is the ability to use it for innovation, for driving change, is fundamentally powerful. Then I think the third thing which you referenced, and was also referenced in the video, is the skill sets to support areas like the supply chain, like data systems, where the private sector has critical capability to allow us to really accelerate reach or increase the efficiency of the programs that we do. So they're all fundamentally powerful, and the role of all of the health actors, I think, is we're looking to sort of, if you like, point people in the direction of their area of interest. So if people are looking to support another area, they want to support research and development. We just know what the Global Fund does, but we're part of the collective in Act A that is supporting that. So we've already played that role for a number of actors already. Our goal is to mobilize the resources to deal with the crisis, and the Global Fund, I think, plays a big role, but we're not the only one. You're completely right.
Great. Thanks, John. Well, we'll get a little bit more into that into some of the later Q&A. And just for all the participants, you can either ask a question by putting it in the chat, or raising your hand, and I'll call on you. Or also you could just message me directly and I can actually pose your question. So now I'll just turn to Jennifer. I think some of the people will know about RED, and others are less familiar, but it's undeniable the impact from an awareness and advocacy and really mindset level RED has had on really what has been and what was one of the and is one of the most challenging diseases, and was really a supreme challenge in the 20th century as a pandemic, and continues to be something that affects so many people around the world. But Jennifer, there's so much that RED has learned around how to engage the private sector, the broader public, raising advocacy awareness, really going deep into what it really takes to move the needle on some of these issues. And as you start to apply that to the current situation on COVID, it would be great to get your sense of how you're seeing things today, but really how we can leverage this moment to really be a game changer going forward. So I'll turn it to you. I know there's also a video, but maybe you want to say something and then Rula can play the video.
Yeah, thanks so much, Taufiq, and thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to be surrounded by this group. So thanks for giving me this opportunity. Before we play the video, I just have to, every time John and I do this, or I do something like this with the Global Fund, I'm reminded of how grateful we at RED are for the Global Fund, but that the world at large should really be grateful for the Global Fund. And I think, RED was really created with one mission, which is to drive money to the Global Fund. So that is why we exist. Yesterday, actually, hence my flowers, was the 15th birthday of our announcement on the snowy hills of Davos. I'm sure many of us probably would be in Davos right now, but that was where back in 2006, the idea for RED was first unveiled. And so over the past 15 years, I think, while we were created to rally the private sector on behalf of the Global Fund for another pandemic, a pandemic that is still thriving, unfortunately, in HIV and AIDS, it was really created, as the color of an emergency. The world now faces two emergencies. And so we are in the process of battling both of them and rallying the private sector for both of them. So before we get too far, I think a video sometimes tells the story a little bit better than me and sets the tone, gives you, because I think some of you may not be overly familiar with RED. So if we could just play the video, I think it'll give you a good idea about how we do things, and then I can come back and talk a little bit more.
I don't know what the hit record is, but yeah, I know I like this vibe.
My desire was humble when I started out, and now it's time. I start a fire. Deep in my soul, I walk the wire to the end.
From Lagos Island to Machingolosa, them don't know, but them gonna say. Them soon see the glow is solar. I'm not the first, I can just say it's all over. I cut the cash for all my soldiers. I cut the grass, expose the cobras. Yeah, watch me shine through tinted rovers. Then shut the game down like changing over.
My life, my way. Nobody can get my right to love away.
Thanks so much. So I think that gives a little sense. I mean, obviously it's a little different than what John does, right? So what we're here for is to raise awareness. So, we really have two missions, which is to generate money. At the end of the day, money is needed, as John talked about, but to generate heat. And what we mean by that is making sure that the world takes notice of the need to focus on these issues. And so I think that the good news, if there's some good news in this crazy world that we're living in, is this is what we've been doing for the past 15 years. We have learned a lot. We have really understood why the private sector gets behind these things. I think John talked a lot about the role the private sector can play, but there's not always a playbook for how to do that. And so what we've been able to do, what we want to do is go in, we are not policy and advocacy people. We are marketers. We are strategists at RED. We're a very small team. There's about 25 of us that sit in New York. And our background is in working with companies, understanding what are the business objectives, what are your marketing objectives, what are your employees looking for, why do your customers come to you, and then really understanding how we can take that knowledge and turn it into a campaign that can help be a win for the company, because this can't just be about cutting checks. This can't just be about, going into your checkbook and writing a check and sending it off and watching the impact. This is about engaging companies, engaging their customers, engaging their employees. And let's face it, there's a lot of companies out there whose employees are struggling, whose employees want to feel like they're making a difference. And so what RED's been able to do is get in and understand all of that, work with these companies and create programs that are not only, selling their RED products like my RED iPhone or my RED iWatch or my Apple Watch or RED Vespa, but also getting in there and helping people to care so that when they're buying that product, they're understanding that that product is also making an impact. So in terms of where we are now, obviously last year the world blew up in front of us, and we had to start thinking about how do we take the RED brand and position it in a way that can drive maximum impact. And the Global Fund, as John mentioned, set up the COVID-19 response mechanism with the goal of generating $1 billion. Obviously, $1 billion is not going to come from the private sector. That's not what we're here for. We're not here to fill every gap. But what we are here for is to catalyze momentum as well as money. And the idea being that, as I was saying before, is if we can get people to care in these companies, and John mentioned very, very articulately about the role the private sector can play. So yes, it is about money, but oftentimes we will have companies and company leaders, bold, courageous CEOs that are stepping up and helping Congress realize the importance of these issues. So but I also think what's important for us is we can't expect CEOs or government leaders. We can't expect government leaders to listen to CEOs who are not invested in this themselves. And so what we're trying to figure out is how can we get the CEOs and the biggest companies of the world to take a greater investment and a greater focus on these pandemics that are facing the world right now. And we started working on this last year. Some of our partners decided to move their funding into the COVID-19 response, and as such, move their messaging into referencing that they are helping to fight this pandemic. Companies like Apple not only moved their money into the COVID response, it also gave us a platform to say, we are able to fund the COVID response to stop the threat of this new pandemic on the 15 years of progress we've made on the other pandemics that we've been fighting. And so I think that's and the result was a very positive feedback from customers, from employees and others. And so that was a big win. But I think, we've been having a lot of conversations about this. And I think as you saw at the end of our video, it feels like COVID is the thing that, until all of us are safe, none of us are safe. And I think what's happening, at least in the United States, and I think in other parts of the world, we're starting to see vaccines roll off of trucks. And people are starting to think, oh, I see the beginning of the end here. I see the light at the end of the tunnel. By summer, oh my gosh, we're back to normal. And the reality is you cannot have a nationalistic response to this global pandemic. We must approach it globally, because just because I'm seeing differences in New York City, it doesn't mean that that's what's happening on the ground in different parts of the world. And if it isn't tackled everywhere in the world, it is tackled nowhere in the world. So for us, I think what's important is, for so many of these companies, as John mentioned, many of these companies have struggled, but many of these companies have thrived. And so it's now their turn to step up. And many of them have, quite frankly, they have. I'm not saying that they haven't, but they need to continue to step up. And, somebody had said, I saw somewhere recently when someone was saying about, well, we can't afford to do this. And I think the point is, you can't not afford to do this. We can't not afford to do this, because this is, the rollout in ending COVID, as I believe we all know, will be the biggest global health effort in the history of the world. That means that governments need to step up and the private sector needs to step up. And so what RED is doing is trying to get that message out there and help companies understand. And also, at the end of the day, I'd like to think everybody's doing this for the moral imperative, but I also recognize that some of these companies maybe want to get credit for what they're doing, and RED can help them do that. So that's a little bit about what we're up to, but I'd love to I'm happy to take any questions from you, Taufiq.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, it's fascinating to hear not just Red's story, but the parallels of dealing with a global emergency. And as you spoke, these emergencies don't go away, and the same is going to be true for COVID. Um, so on that point, Jen, as you look at, there's obviously, you mentioned HIV, COVID. The Global Fund works on malaria and TB as well. How do we kind of consolidate this a little bit? Because we're often talking about the same health systems, the same populations, sometimes the same type of awareness in terms of measures to take. Is there a way to bring this together, especially coming out of this, as we think about a resilient world and that can really be ready to confront a lot of health challenges and a lot of challenges?
I mean, it's interesting because it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, which is why I'm so grateful for the Global Fund, because they're responsible for doing all the hard work of making it all happen. I think from our perspective, where I come from is, again, and this is because I have a marketer's hat on, right? Like, what is the impact to me, not me as Jennifer from Red, but what is the impact of me as a human being in this global world that we're living in? So for me, it's like, at the end of the day, our co-founder Bono has often referenced this: where you live shouldn't determine whether you live, right? And so to me, it is that moral imperative. It's the humanity around why we're doing what we should be doing. And so I think from my perspective, you've got to elevate it to that higher level, and then have the Global Fund, who are the real experts, be responsible for where does it go. And we've been having a lot of conversations recently because, we have not in the past focused on vaccines because we've been focused on HIV and AIDS, and there is no vaccine, which is a whole other issue that we've been fighting this thing for 30 years and there's no vaccine, and yet we've got a vaccine within a year for something else. But that's a whole other panel. But I think that, from our perspective, we've got to present the whole solution. We've got to present the impact that you can have and why you should do it. I'm going to let John and all of those guys put all of this to work on the ground. But what I need to know is, I understand when you say no one is safe until everyone's safe. I get that. I philosophically get that as a human being. And I think, again, Red thinks like a brand. So like, how would Apple or how would Nike do this? And that's what we do. Like, we can do the sexy stuff to get people involved because John and his teams can be responsible for doing the hard work on the ground. But I think we've got to get people to care. We have got to get this to register. We work a lot with Apple. They're one of our biggest partners. They've generated almost $250 million for the Global Fund so far. And what we'd often struggled with is they would give us all this incredible real estate, the App Store and iTunes, and you'd put it out there, about funding an AIDS response, and there wasn't the same thing as if, they do that also if there was a tsunami or an earthquake, right? Like American Red Cross, and it was in the headlines every day, so people will click on it, and of course they're giving money. Well, unfortunately, HIV and AIDS has not been in the headlines. COVID is in the headlines, but at the end of the day, these are all pandemics that need a response. So we've got to get people to understand that what would be crazy is if we didn't know how to solve this. We know how to solve this. We have the tools. We've created a vaccine in record time. We have incredible therapeutics and testing that has been made available in short order. Now we just got to get it out there. And people need to understand what it takes to get it out there. They don't need all of the details of Gavi and COVAX and the Global Fund. And they just need to know that there is a solution out there, at least from a Red perspective, again, from a consumer's perspective. And if we've done that job, I think it makes everything else a little bit easier, whether you're a person sitting in Parliament or a person sitting and walking into an Apple store. We all have the same intention.
So just before I open it up, question. Red has this great story, a great founding team, so many, fantastic relationships, and its products that you are affiliated with reach everywhere. I have my watch as well, and But you know, the UAE is an interesting place, right? And for Red, also thinking globally, I mean, how are you seeing the UAE just, you know, from the outset? I mean, do you see an opportunity, how it links into the world, or, you know, it'd be great to just hear that.
I'm so glad you asked that, because it probably does sound kind of funny, right? Because it has not been an area of focus for us, and for many reasons in terms of connections that we've had and conversations that we've had. And I had the ability to come to Abu Dhabi just before the lockdown for the Reaching the Last Mile forum. You know, the interesting thing from my perspective, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, is it feels like Abu Dhabi is ripe for a sort of red campaign or a red push, right? There is, you know, and obviously some of this is COVID has had an impact on it. But when we started these conversations was before COVID, right? There is a commercialism and a capitalism that's happening there. There's consumer spending. You're engaging with brands. Many of the brands that we have in the family already, whether it's Apple or Vespa or Louis Vuitton or some of the Mont Blanc, some of the others. So the question is, and it feels like it's an approachable enough region that we could have a targeted campaign and a targeted response. So whether what in an ideal world is we would bring the partners that are already there, and then maybe bring some locals or multinational companies that have not engaged, and create a really powerful statement. You know, in France, at the end of 2019, at the Global Fund's sixth replenishment, the UAE, I believe for the first time, stepped up with a pledge of 55 million euros, I believe, or something around there. So you all have put a stake in the ground. You know, the government is stepping up. So now, again, just like we do in other parts of the world, what more can we do to understand? It clearly is a priority. So now how do we make sure that the private sector is also playing their role? Because that is, again, where I started was, there has to be a yin yang between the private sector and the public sector for this to work. And it feels like we've got one piece of that. And now we feel like there's an opportunity to dial it up. I think there's also, you know, you have a convening moment around the Dubai Expo. And so for us, we're trying to think about what could that look like? You have a convening of all of these people. Obviously it's been moved, but I think for us, those are the moments in time that we would be crazy to not focus on and see what we could do. So we're always trying to tap new markets, and it feels like this is an important one. And clearly the interest has been started with that Global Fund replenishment commitment.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. All right, so we'll just turn to a few questions that have come in. And if you have questions, please, again, feel free to message them in, or also write them in the chat, or raise your hand, you know, just using that feature, and we'll come to you. So I'll just turn to Tasha Young, actually. I think you had sent in a question. So Tasha, maybe if you want to pose it yourself directly would be great.
Sure, Taufiq, sorry. I think the video has been disabled for me. So I just wanted to ask to both of you, really, working for global organizations and hoping businesses are going to take a more global outlook to help address these challenges. So COVID-19 has definitely spotlighted the need for greater global response from business, but it's also highlighted the importance of building local resilience. I think we found that communities in many ways have become the first responders in such a complex crisis. And I think a lot of businesses are seeing a greater need closer to home. So I wanted to ask how you're really sort of building that case for continued global response in addition to community response.
John, do you want to, I can take what first, and then John, I can hand it to you.
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting because it's different in every market. And I think, you know, when COVID first hit, we really struggled with this. We wanted to help with PPE. We wanted to, you know, have our partners help with these various different things. And it was tricky because I live in New York City and we didn't have PPE at Mount Sinai on the Upper West Side. And so in order to get, Americans and even New Yorkers to think about, oh, I want to invest in getting PPE to sub-Saharan Africa, we felt like would be a difficult challenge. And so, we had a lot of thinking around that. I think it makes it a little bit easier. Again, this is why it differs by market, but it makes it a little bit easier when there, just as an example with vaccine rollouts, right? Like the vaccine rollout, and I'm not saying anything that's not true and widely reported, but the vaccine rollout in the United States is a disaster. And so I think that, but at the end of the day, you don't have to pay for vaccines here. They're being provided by the government. Everything's being taken care of by the government. And I think that for us, shouldn't everybody in the world have that same opportunity? And so that's where I think from our perspective, it always has to be a balance. We can't come off as tin-eared when there are challenges that we are facing. But I do think that, again, elevating it to say it has to be a global response. Like, I know we will work out all of our components of testing, and it's been a little ugly, but we're getting there in the States at least, and certainly other parts of the world. I think it will be a delicate balance, but it does get back to that need for a global response in order for this to finally be ended, in what period of time, I don't know. But that is something that we're constantly balancing. But John, I don't know if you were going to say something as well.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think the truth is, as you said, Tasha, that the crisis has demonstrated, how fundamental that local resilience is, and not least because, I mean, to Jen's point, that the global response has failed. I mean, the bun fight for PPE. You had ridiculous issues where South African manufacturers of PPE were forced to sell to the US because of the trade laws and everything else that we have in place. So it's actually generated a huge amount of innovation and investment domestically. I mean, if you look at things like the Africa CDC, it's been a fantastic leader in developing the response in Africa, and it's built a procurement platform and a number of initiatives which are, I think, fundamentally important. And so I think a couple of things. One is, I think the trajectory as we go forward has to be about the global response investing in local resilience in a much more direct way, and particularly in the private sector. The private sector is 50% of healthcare in most low-income countries, and it needs to be invested in to be more resilient to deal with this crisis, because the public sector actually relies on it even more in a crisis. And that means, I think, the second thing, which is, I think the skill transfer and the investment and the support for that, building that resilience of domestic private sector, is fundamentally powerful. We have a number of partnerships with organizations like Microsoft and MasterCard, which is about bringing skills and capabilities to countries like Rwanda and Mozambique and others. And that sort of skill transfer and building sort of world-class capability in a rapid time, I think is fundamental now in the crisis, but it's something we should have been doing for many, many years. And that's where I think the resources and the leadership and obviously the investment is going to be really powerful to build resilience. We need to do it in the public sector too. It's clear. I mean, if you look at the basic analysis, there are many countries where we've been building effective health systems for years that have responded to COVID much more effectively than the high-income countries where we haven't had that. Now, I don't think we should think the next pandemic will look exactly like COVID. So I'm not sure we can relax to say that everything's going to be fine, because it's not now. And it may well be very different in the future. But the point is that having built those resilient health systems, public and private, it puts countries in a much more powerful position to deal with the current pandemics. Jen's saying, we forget that HIV, TB, malaria are pandemics because they don't kill people in rich countries. um, and also deal with the future ones. So I think that's going to be a big shift in the future, and I think it's where the private sector has an incredible role to play to build the resilience of the domestic private sector in other countries.
Great. We have another question from Isra Rahman. So Isra, if you want to go ahead, and I think Isra also, you know, thinking about the role of the private sector here, I think you're very privy to how the UAE can be a convening kind of force. So I'll turn it to you.
Hi, thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to thank John and Jennifer. It was really insightful getting your perspectives on the current situation. So I had a couple of questions, and you both touched upon it throughout your talks, but I wanted to ask you what the future ODA trends are from the GCC countries, specifically, you know, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Qatar, and what role can Middle East donor countries play on the ACT-A accelerator? So yeah.
So, I mean, I think I'll turn that to the team, but really, I think obviously the ODA trends in the region, this is the development assistance, just like around the world, you know, given the very state of the economic situation is being affected, and the Gulf is no different. And I think, as Jennifer, you mentioned, a lot of the Gulf countries, including the UAE, are actually now part of some of these instruments, like the Global Fund. I think maybe, just building on that question, John, you could talk about how the private sector in the Middle East could also be supportive of the ACT accelerator. I think that could be very interesting to speak to.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the sort of ODA trends, not just in the Middle East, but I'm from the UK, and the UK is currently in a sort of almost a complicated position. Maybe I should be politically correct in terms of its ODA assistance. I think it's some of it is the context of what Jen talked to, which is bringing people back, and I'm not sure. I don't understand if this crisis hasn't brought to people's attention the sort of need for global response and global agenda. It's very unclear to me what actually we need as a crisis to bring that to people's attention. So if we can't move ODA, because of this, the pure economic, rationale, on top of the moral rationale, I guess we're waiting for the next pandemic to be worse, which of course it's really not a, hopefully the agenda we move in. So, I think the UAE actually, in the Global Fund replenishment, it plays a really important role in being a new and being sort of newly engaged in these spaces. The leadership of the G20, I think was really powerful recently, and so I think its voice is in some ways more powerful than perhaps some of the the usual voices that you have. In terms of the ACT accelerator, I mean, there's a whole host of ways to support it, and happy to, as I said, to sort of triage people in the right direction. There are different streams. So there's a stream on vaccines, there's a stream on the diagnostics, stream on therapeutics, and a stream on the health systems. It's made up of the sort of core actors, if you like, who drive those places. The Global Fund is actually a lead actor in three of them, not the vaccines, although we're supporting that in the background through the diagnostics, the therapeutics, and the health systems work that we're doing. I think the role of the private sector breaks down into the three things we've talked about. The sort of voice and the mobilization that Jen talked about with Red, I think is fundamentally powerful, and it's not always about advocacy per se or lobbying. It's about the recognition and joining the movement around these issues, as we saw around HIV, TB, and malaria. I think the sort of capability piece understanding how core capabilities can be supported, and really we're very much led by countries and what countries need, so that we're not turning up with with great things that are being offered, but actually country doesn't want them. So using the partners like the Global Fund and Gavi and WHO to actually understand what actually is needed. How can my resources really drive change, as we've done with Microsoft and MasterCard and Coca-Cola and many others, is really important. But those in-kind resources can be very powerful. And then, of course, the money, and I think the money can come in a number of different ways. I mean, obviously, philanthropy or funding is fantastic. And as I said, the for us and for the other actors, the sort of catalytic nature of private money, investing in innovation and change is really powerful, because public money doesn't always want to take the risk in those spaces. So those spaces, I think, are really core. But also for financial institution investment, building out investment models that support, as Tasha was talking about, the development of domestic private sector in Africa or Asia or many other countries is really powerful. So, I think we can play, but we're not the only agency, a guiding role in where's most impactful to deliver resources. And I, personally think we won't deal with this crisis. We won't prepare the world for the next one if we don't throw a whole load more resources at the public, at the health systems in the next sort of 12, 24 months, without it.
Great. So I think maybe just to bring some of this, together, as we kind of move towards kind of wrapping up, Jennifer and John, it'd be good to kind of hear a little bit around kind of your closing thoughts, kind of where we headed, and what is really kind of, are there actions that can be taken? Are we moving to an action? I think, we're going to hopefully follow up with everybody on this call, but also beyond. It'd be great to think, how do we take some of this conversation, but start thinking about action? So maybe I'll start with you, Jen, and then move to John, and we'll close.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think, Isra, to your question, obviously I don't sit in the world of ODA, right? Because I'm so focused on the private sector, but I do think no matter where you are, it's really the same point. And, we have an advisory board at RED that's made up of, private sector leaders across different fields. And I think, one of the things that we keep hearing over and over again is everybody needs to understand the economic impact, right? Like, especially the CEOs, the courageous, bold leaders that are out there that need to step up. John mentioned their voice. I've mentioned using their voice. I think you can't really use your voice if you haven't invested yourselves, but I'll put that to the side. But helping people understand, and look, CEOs, private sector leaders understand numbers, right? They're driven by numbers. And I think, there's a number of institutions that have done tons of data-driven research to really understand what this economic potential is. We know the world we're living in right now. I was just listening to the news this morning. They were reporting in New York City, the hotel industry in New York City will take 4 years to recover. That's one tiny industry in one small city in the world, right? So I think that understanding the numbers, the economic impact, again, not focused on the moral imperative, I'll put that to the side. The economic impact of the need to act, and act now. As John mentioned, we can't wait. Every day we're waiting, this thing is winning. And so I think that, the private sector plays a role with their checkbook, yes, but with their voices, and helping the world understand that the ability to focus on this globally, and the economic impact that will have. Look, this is, the healthcare implications of COVID are one obviously very, very big piece of this, but the economic part of it is never going to turn around if we don't focus on the healthcare effort. So I think, for us, it's a matter of really trying to get, especially in countries like the United States and others, it's really trying to get the private sector to understand the need for a global response and then use their checkbooks and their voices to get the governments of the world. So hopefully we're all marching in the same direction.
Thank you, Jen. John?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what Jen said. I mean, I think the challenge with this is it's so big, and you know, there's always a danger, I think, that people feel they can't make a difference because it's so big. You know, so we donate a small amount of money, we provide a bit of resources, we use our voice in a little way, it doesn't have an impact. I mean, I think Jen's point, and you know, one of the striking things I think I discovered when I joined the Global Fund, which I don't think is apparent from the outside, and it's true of a number of organisations, is the Global Fund is a sort of public-private partnership. Its impact is because it's a collective. It's not because it's a large institution. It moves the private sector, civil society, and the public sector in unison on an agenda. It sort of collates the sort of critical mass of many actors. The public sector, who funds us significantly, the private sector, who provides all the things we talked about on this call. And I think that's what we need to create this collective movement against COVID. And we need to create the collective movement that moves the public sector, the governments, to actually invest much more significantly than they have, or a tiny portion of what they've invested in the domestic crisis in order to deal with the global crisis, in order to make sure the economic impact doesn't stay, and the crisis doesn't continue to rebound around the world. And then the private sector the same, to be a collective voice, to join the RED partners, to join the Global Fund partners, to join the Gavi partners. I mean, join the collective that you're interested in. But that collective is fundamentally powerful, I think, in changing this direction. And so, whatever your size, I think that's for me, the message is we will move this if we move a global effort consistently. And Act A has been a fundamentally powerful thing in moving the development of new tools. We now need to move the deployment of those tools in a global context, and we need to provide exactly the same sort of collective power to doing that, I think, would be my message.
Great. Well, thank you, John and Jennifer. It's really been an insightful discussion to get a wide range on this topic, but then also how we can really move from the awareness to action. We're going to be following up with a series of conversations around the COVID response and really, thinking of what, a healthier, stronger world looks like. And we have so many moments here in the UAE, but also globally to leverage, whether it is Expo, whether it's the Generation Equality Forum, whether it's going to be others as well. And so I think this is the start of a conversation. Hope to engage with you going forward, as well as everybody on the call, and to those who weren't able to join, who will share this with later. Thank you so much. We really look forward to kind of continue to engage with you on some of these important themes and topics. We'll be in touch, and please keep a lookout for future events and activities on this. So thank you very much. Wishing everybody, safe health and good health during these times, and see everybody again soon.
Thanks so much, Taufiq.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.